The Edge Chronicles, Beyond the Deep Woods, by Paul Stewart and Chris Riddle. Narrated by P. Waitonik. Chapter 1. The Snatchwood Cabin. Twig sat on the floor between his mother's knees and curled his toes in the thick fleece of the tilde rug. It was cold and draughty in the cabin. Twig leaned forwards and opened the door of the stove. "I want to tell you the story of how you got your name," his mother said. "But I know that story, mother mine," Twig protested. Spelda sighed. Twig felt her warm breath on the back of his neck and smelled the pickled twerpweed she had eaten for lunch. He wrinkled his nose. Like so much of the food which the wood trolls relished, Twig found tripweed disgusting, particularly pickled. It was slimy and smelled of rotten eggs. "This time it will be a little different," he heard his mother saying. "This time I will finish the tale." Twig frowned. "I thought I'd already heard the ending." Spelda tousled her son's thick black hair. "He's grown so fast," she thought, and wiped a tear from the end of her rubbery button nose. "A tale can have many endings," she said sadly, and watched the purple light from the fire gleaming on Twig's high cheekbones and sharp chin. "From the moment you were born," she begun, as she always began, "you were different." Twig nodded. It has been painful, so painful, being different when he was growing up. Yet it amused him now to think of his parents' surprise when he had appeared, dark, green-eyed, smooth skin, and already with unusually long legs, for a wood troll. He stared into the fire. The luffwood was burning very well. Purple flames blazed all around the stubby logs as they bumped and tumbled around inside the stove. The wood trolls had many types of wood to choose from, and each had its own special properties. Scentwood, for instance, burned with a fragrance that sent those who breathed it drifting into a dream-filled sleep, while wood from the silvery turquoise lullaby tree sang as the flames lapped at its bark. Strange, mournful songs they were, and not at all to everyone's taste. And then there was the blood oak, complete with its parasitic sidekick, a barbed creeper known as tarry vine. Obtaining blood oak wood was hazardous. Any wood troll who did not know his wood lore was liable to end up satisfying the tree's love of flesh. For the blood, oak and the tarry vine were two of the greatest dangers in the dark and perilous deep woods. Certainly the wood of the blood oak gave off a lot of heat, and it neither smelled nor sang, but the way it wailed and screamed as it burned put off all but a few. No, among the wood trolls, luffwood was by far the most popular. It burned well, and they found its purple glow restful. Twig yawned, and Spelda continued her story. Her voice was high-pitched, but guttural. It seemed to gurgle in the back of her throat. "At 4 months, you were already walking upright," she was saying, and Twig heard the pride of his mother's words. Most wood troll children remained down on their knuckles until they were at least 18 months old. "But," Twig whispered softly. Drawn back inside the story despite himself, he was already anticipating the next part. It was time for the but. Every time it arrived, Twig would shudder and hold his breath. "But," she said, "although you are ahead of others physically, you would not speak. 3 years old you were, and not a single word." She shifted round in her chair. "And I don't have to tell you how serious that can be." Once again, his mother sighed. Once again, Twig screwed up his face in disgust. Something Taghair had once said came back to him. "Your nose knows where you belong." Twig had taken it to mean that he would always recognize the unique smell of his own home. But what if he was wrong? What if the wise old oak elf had been saying, in his usual roundabout way, that because his nose didn't like what it smelled, this was not his home. Twig swallowed guilty. This was something he wished so often as he lay in his bunk after yet another day of being teased and taunted and bullied. Through the window, the sun was sinking lower in the dappled sky. The zigzag silhouettes of the Deepwood pines were glinting like frozen bolts of lightning. Twig knew there would be snow before his father returned that night. He thought of Tum-Tum, out there in the deep woods, far beyond the anchor tree. Perhaps at the very moment he was sinking his axe into the trunk of a blood oak. Twig shuddered. His father's telling tales had filled him with deep horror on many a howling night. Although he was a master carver, Twig Snatchwood earned most of his money from the illicit repair of the sky pirate ship. This meant using buoyant wood, and the most buoyant wood of all was blood oak. Twig was uncertain of his father's feelings toward him. Whenever Twig returned to the cabin with a bloodied nose, or blackened eyes, or clothes covered in slung mud, he wanted his father to wrap him up in his arms and soothe the pain away. Instead, Tum-Tum would give him advice and make demands. "Bloody their noses," he said once. "Black their eyes, and throw not mud but dung. Show them what you're made of." Later, when his mother was smoothing Heilberry salve onto his bruises, she would explain that Tum-Tum was only concerned to prepare him for the harshness of the world outside. But Twig was unconvinced. It was not concern he had seen in Tum-Tum's eyes, but contempt. Twig absentmindedly wound a strand of his long, dark hair round and round his finger as Spelda went on with her story. "Names," she was saying. "Where would we wood trolls be without them? They tame the wild things of the Deepwoods and give us our own identity. Ne'er sip of a nameless soup, as the saying goes. Oh, Twig, how I fretted when at 3 years old you were still without a name." Twig shivered. He knew that any wood troll who died without a name would be doomed to an eternity in open sky. The trouble was that until an infant had uttered its first word, the naming ritual could not take place. "Was I really so silent, mother mine?" said Twig. Spelda looked away. "Not a single word passed your lips. I thought perhaps you were like your great-grandfather Weasel. He never spoke either," she sighed. "So on your 3rd birthday I decided to perform the ritual anyway. Did great-grandfather Weasel look like me?" Twig interrupted. "No, Twig," said Spelda. "There has never been a Snatchwood nor any other wood troll who has ever looked like you." Twig tugged at the twist of his hair. "Am I ugly?" he said. Spelda chuckled. As she did so, her downy cheeks puffed out, and her small charcoal-gray eyes disappeared in folds of leathery skin. "I don't think so," she said. She leaned forwards and wrapped her long arms around Twig's chest. "You'll always be my beautiful boy." She paused. "Now, where was I?" "Naming the ritual," Twig reminded her. He had heard the story so often, he was no longer sure what he could remember and what he had been told. As the sun rose, Spelda had taken the well-worn path which led to the anchor tree. There, she tethered herself to its bulky trunk and set off into the dark woods. This was dangerous not only because of the unseen perils that lurked in the deep woods, but because there was always the chance that the rope would snag and break. Wood Troll's deepest terror was being lost. Those who did stray from the path and lose their way were vulnerable to attacks from the Gloamglazer, the wildest of all the wild creatures in the deep woods. Every wood troll lived in constant terror of an encounter with the fearsome beast. Spelda herself had often frightened her older children with tales of the forest bogeyman. "If you don't stop being such a naughty wood troll," she would say, "the Gloamglazer will get you." Deeper and deeper into the deep woods Spelda went. All round her the forest echoed with howls and shrieks of concealed beasts. She fingered the amulets and lucky charms around her neck and prayed for a swift and safe return.